The fence post split the afternoon sky like a scar, and Ruby Reed stood on her side of it with a rifle in her hands and fire in her eyes, staring at the man who had just crossed onto her land without invitation. Arthur Garrett did not flinch. He was broad through the shoulders, sun-darkened in the way of men who had spent decades under an unforgiving sky, and his jaw held the particular hardness that came not from cruelty, but from grief carried too long without being set down. He stood there at the fence line between his property and hers, his hat pushed back just enough to let her see his eyes, and those eyes were not cold. They were something far more dangerous than cold. They were honest. "You have been working this land alone long enough," he said. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, and Ruby felt the ripples move through her chest in a way she had not expected and absolutely did not welcome. She raised the rifle an inch higher. "That is my business," she said, "not yours. Your south pasture wire is down in 3 places," he said. "Your cattle drifted into my north field this morning. I drove them back. I would have found them." "You would have," he agreed. "Eventually. After you finished pulling the calf that was breech in your barn at 3 in the morning, after you mended the pump housing that cracked in last week's frost, and after you hauled enough firewood to keep from freezing before any of that." He paused. "I counted the rings under your eyes, Ruby Reed. A woman can only run on empty for so long before the land takes more than she can give." The use of her full name hit her differently than she wanted it to. Nobody had said her full name with that kind of weight since her husband Thomas had spoken it 3 years ago, the last time before the fever took him. She lowered the rifle by 2 inches and hated herself for it. "I do not need a neighbor's charity," she said. "It is not charity," Arthur said. "It is a proposition." That was the moment Ruby Reed understood that everything she had built her solitude upon was about to be tested in ways she had not prepared for, because Arthur Garrett was not a man who made propositions lightly, and the look in his eyes told her that whatever he was about to say next would change the shape of things between them in a way that could not be undone. She had not known him long. That was the truth she tried to hold on to as she stood at that fence in the autumn of 1882, on the Colorado plains where the wind came down from the mountains with an edge that reminded you exactly how small a human body was against the scale of the land. She had arrived in Crestfall County 4 years ago as Thomas Reed's wife, full of hope and absolutely unprepared for what frontier life would demand of her. Thomas had been a good man, a gentle man. A man who loved her truly and worked the land beside her, and made her feel like the two of them could hold back the wilderness with nothing but determination and shared purpose. Then the fever swept through the valley in the autumn of 1879, moving from family to family like a whispered secret, and Thomas Reed had been among those it took. He had burned for 4 days and spoken her name on the last morning, and then he was gone. And Ruby was 26 years old with 160 acres, 40 head of cattle, 2 horses, a debt at the bank in Crestfall, and a grief so enormous she had to break it into small pieces just to breathe through it. She had stayed. That had been the first choice, and in some ways the hardest one, because her mother back in Missouri had written immediately, urging her to come home, and the bank manager had suggested politely that a widow might find the land difficult to manage. Ruby had looked at both suggestions with the same expression she now used on Arthur Garrett, and she had stayed. 3 years of staying alone had carved something hard and necessary into her character. She had learned to doctor cattle, to read weather in the color of clouds, to swing an axe and dig post holes and haggle with the feed merchant in town who initially tried to charge her more than he charged the men because he assumed she would not notice. She noticed. She corrected him. She did not go back to him after that, driving an extra 8 miles to the supply post at Harker's Crossing instead, and the story of it became small-town legend in the way that small things do when the community has little enough drama to fill its winters. She had also learned to be alone in the deep and specific way that living truly alone teaches you, which is different from mere solitude. She had learned the way silence fills a house after dark, the way it sits in the chair where a person used to sit, the way it rises with you in the morning and follows you to the field, She had made a kind of peace with it. Not happiness, not acceptance exactly, but an armed truce. Arthur Garrett had appeared on the adjoining property 18 months ago when old Walt Birch finally sold the Birch Ranch and moved to live with his daughter in Denver. The sale had taken everyone by surprise. Walt had seemed like the kind of man who would die in his own pasture, but apparently daughters were more persuasive than people gave them credit for. Arthur had arrived alone, which in itself was not unusual for men who bought frontier land. What was unusual was the efficiency with which he moved. He repaired every fence line within the first 3 weeks. He hired 2 hands, both of them experienced and quiet, and did not drink with them at the saloon in Crestfall the way most cattlemen did, which made the town talk because they did not know what to make of a man who did not explain himself. He ran a clean operation. His cattle were healthy. His bills at the merchant were paid on time and in full. Ruby had observed him the way she observed all potential complications, which was to say carefully and from a distance, and without allowing herself to form opinions prematurely. She had nodded to him twice at the Harker's Crossing supply post. He had nodded back. She had asked the postmaster's wife, who knew everything about everyone within 30 miles, what she could learn about Arthur Garrett. The postmaster's wife, a woman named Della Prout who had once been a schoolteacher and retained a schoolteacher's talent for organized information, had told her that Arthur Garrett was 41 years old, that he had come from New Mexico Territory where he had run cattle for 20 years, that he had been married once to a woman named Clara who had died in childbirth along with the child 7 years ago, and that he had sold his New Mexico operation shortly after and spent several years working as a hired man on other people's ranches, as if he could not bear to build something of his own while the grief was still fresh. Ruby had sat with that information for several weeks and found that it changed the shape of Arthur Garrett in her mind in a way she had not wanted it to. She had preferred him as a simple neighboring inconvenience. The information made him a man with a wound, and wounds in men were dangerous to women who had learned to live without needing to tend to anyone but themselves. So she had kept her distance deliberately, politely, and with complete intention, which made the afternoon at the fence all the more unsettling, because Arthur Garrett had come to her side of things with purpose in his stride and truth in his eyes, and she was not prepared. "A proposition," she repeated, making the word flat. "Your land and mine share the same water source from the creek," he said. "The drought last summer nearly ran it dry for both of us. Come this summer it will be worse. If we share resources, rotate the grazing on the south sections together, and split the cost of deepening the well on the ridge, both operations survive what is coming. Separately, I am not certain either one of us does." Ruby looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved between them. A hawk circled overhead in wide, patient loops the way hawks do when they are waiting for something to stop moving. "That is a business arrangement," she said, "not a proposition." "It is the start of one," he said quietly. "I am aware it requires trust. I am also aware I have not given you particular reason to extend it. I am asking you to hear me out before you decide." She should have said no. She knew she should have said no. The refusal was already formed in her throat, practical and clean and self-protective, and what she said instead was, "Come to the house then. I will put coffee on." She turned away from the fence before she could see whatever expression crossed his face at that, because she did not want to know yet whether it was triumph or relief or something else entirely, and she walked back toward the farmhouse with her spine straight and her heart doing something complicated and unauthorized inside her chest. The farmhouse that Ruby Reed had built her life around was not large, but it was tidy in the way that matters more than size, which is to say it was maintained. The porch boards were sound. The windows were clean. The woodpile beside the door was stacked with the kind of systematic precision that comes from knowing you are responsible for keeping yourself warm and having no margin for carelessness. Inside, the main room served as kitchen and parlor both, with a cast-iron stove that Ruby had paid for in 3 installments and considered her most important possession, a table with 2 chairs, shelves of preserved food in glass jars that lined one wall like a library of survival, and one photograph on the mantelpiece of Thomas Reed looking somewhat startled by the photographer's flash. Arthur sat in one of the chairs and took his hat off and set it on the table. Without it, his face was different. Less armored. He had lines at the corners of his eyes and a jaw that held tension like a man who had spent years keeping things contained, and dark hair that was threaded through with silver at the temples in the way that happens to men when they have carried enough sorrow for long enough. Ruby set the coffee to boil and stood with her back to him at the stove for longer than was strictly necessary, because she needed a moment to reassemble herself into the version of Ruby Reed who did not notice things about men's faces. "You know this country will hit drought again," he said to her back. "I do," she said. "Your south pasture is running thinner grass than it should for this time of year. You have been overusing it because you do not have enough range to rotate properly with your current fencing configuration." She turned around. "You have been observing my land in some detail for a man who said nothing about it until today." Something crossed his face. Not guilt exactly, more like the acknowledgement of a fair point. "I have," he said. "I am not apologetic about it. I have been trying to understand whether what I was considering was workable before I said anything that could not be unsaid." "What were you considering?" she said. He looked at her directly, and she recognized in that look the particular quality of a man who had decided to stop being careful and say the true thing. It was a quality that made her stomach tight. "I have been considering whether you would be willing to share more than water rights and grazing arrangements," he said. "I have been considering asking whether you might be open to merging these 2 operations into one permanently under a shared arrangement that would benefit both of us and give this land the kind of continuity it deserves." "A business partnership," she said carefully. "Yes," he said, "among other things." The coffee began to boil. Ruby turned back to the stove, removed it from the heat, poured 2 tin cups, and carried them to the table with steady hands that cost her some effort. She sat across from him. "Among other things," she said. "I will be plain," he said. "I respect you too much for anything else. I have been your neighbor for 18 months, and I have watched you work this land with a capability and a stubbornness that I find remarkable. I have also watched you disappear into it in a way that concerns me. You have not been to Crestfall for a social occasion in longer than Delaprout can remember, and she remembers everything. I am not interested in social occasions." "I know," he said. "Nor am I particularly, but I am talking about something different from social occasions. I am talking about the fact that you are 30 years old and you are building walls the same way you stack firewood, and one day you will look up from behind all of it and find that the world outside has gone on without you." Ruby felt the heat in her face before she could stop it. "You have known me for 18 months of nodding across fence lines," she said. "You do not know what I have built or why." "No," he said. "I do not. That is why I am here. I would like to." The silence that followed that sentence was one of the more loaded silences Ruby Reed had ever occupied. She drank her coffee and looked at the table and tried to find the familiar anger that usually served her well in difficult moments, but it had gone somewhere inconvenient. "You had a wife," she said finally. "Clara." If he was surprised that she knew, he did not show it. "Yes. And you are telling me you are willing to open that kind of door again." "I am telling you that I have spent 7 years convinced that it would be a betrayal of her memory to do so," he said. "And that I have recently come to understand that the betrayal is actually in choosing to stay walled off from everything living in order to protect yourself from the risk of losing again. Clara was not a woman who would have wanted that for me." A pause. "Your Thomas was probably not a man who would have wanted it for you either." The mention of Thomas by name, said with such plainness, hit her in the chest like a physical thing. Her throat closed. She looked at the photograph on the mantelpiece and then deliberately back at her coffee cup. "This is a great deal to put on a business proposal," she said, and her voice was steadier than she deserved. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "Something more careful than that. I am aware," he said. I told you I would be plain. I have spent my whole life being straightforward about things, and I do not know how to stop now. The plain truth is that I am not here only about the water rights. The plain truth is that I have been finding reasons to be on the fence line at times I know you will be passing by, and I am not particularly proud of the dishonesty of that, which is why I am correcting it now. Ruby looked at him. The late afternoon light was coming through the window and laying itself across the table between them, and it was a beautiful and entirely inconvenient piece of light. "How long have you been doing that?" she said. "About 4 months," he said without looking away. She stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the land the land she had kept alive with her own hands for 3 years, and she tried to locate the feeling that was moving through her and put it into an accurate category. It was not simple attraction, though that was in it somewhere, lurking in the corners of the feeling like something she was not ready to acknowledge directly. It was something older than that. It was the particular ache of being truly seen by another person after a long time of being invisible, and it was almost unbearable. "I will think about the business arrangement," she said. "That is all I am asking," he said. He finished his coffee, set the cup down, picked up his hat from the table and stood. "For now." She turned from the window. "Arthur." He stopped at the door. "You should know," she said, "that I am not a woman who does anything halfway. If I agree to something, I commit to it completely. And if I find that a person has hidden motives I was not told about, I do not forgive it." He looked at her with those honest, tired eyes. "I have no hidden motives," he said. "I told you everything that is in them." She believed him, and that was the most frightening thing that had happened to her in 3 years. He left. Ruby stood in her farmhouse in the diminishing afternoon light and pressed her hands flat against the tabletop and breathed, slow and deliberate, the way she had learned to breathe through things that were too large to simply feel all at once. Then she went back to work, because the calf in the barn needed checking and the firewood needed stacking, and the fence post on the south pasture needed mending, and the land did not wait for a person to finish being overwhelmed. 2 days passed before she did anything about it. She spent those 2 days doing exactly what she had been doing for 3 years, which was working from first light to last, and not allowing herself space for thoughts that did not directly serve the operation of the ranch. She checked the south pasture wire herself, and found that Arthur had been right about the 3 broken places, which irritated her, and also told her something about the accuracy of his observations. She mended them alone with pliers and a reel of wire in the cold morning, her breath making small clouds in the air, the mountains blue and enormous in the distance. On the 3rd day, she rode to Crestfall. The town of Crestfall, Colorado, was not large. It had a main street with a general store, a bank, a post office, a boarding house that also served as a small hotel, a saloon called the Copper Cup, a church, a livery stable, and a doctor's office that was occupied 3 days a week by Dr. Harlan Moss, who also served 4 other towns within riding distance and was perpetually exhausted. The population was a few hundred souls who all knew each other's business and most of each other's secrets, which in 1882 was simply the way of things in small western towns. Ruby tied her horse at the post outside the general store and went in to buy flour, salt, coffee, and lamp oil, which were the practical items she needed. She was also, she admitted privately to herself, gathering information. Della Prout was at the counter talking to the store owner's wife, as she frequently was, and she lit up when she saw Ruby in the way that people light up when they have been hoarding interesting information and have finally found someone worth sharing it with. "Ruby Reed," Della said. "You look well, tired but well." "I am always tired," Ruby said. "It is the natural condition of a person who works land." "Speaking of land," Della said, in the particular tone of a woman who has been waiting to speak of exactly this, "have you had any dealings with your neighbor, Arthur Garrett?" Ruby kept her face arranged carefully. "He returned some strayed cattle last week." "Did he?" Della said. "That was neighborly of him." She leaned on the counter with the ease of a woman settling in for the full scope of a story. "You know, Several of the men in town have been trying to get a read on him since he arrived. He came in here last Tuesday and bought rope and nails and 3 pounds of coffee and a book of Tennyson's poetry, and I thought that was an interesting combination." Ruby did not let herself react to the poetry. "What else do people know about him?" "He served in the Union Army," Della said, "3rd Colorado Cavalry. He was 17 at the end of the war, so he was not in the thick of the worst of it, but he served. He spent some time in New Mexico Territory after, which is where he built his first operation. A man named Collins who came through from Santa Fe last spring said that Garrett's ranch down there was known as one of the most well-run operations in the territory. When he sold it after his wife died, Collins said people were genuinely sorry to see it go. He was respected." She paused. "He is not a man of many words, but the words he does use are said to be reliable." Ruby bought her flour and salt and coffee and lamp oil. She rode back out toward her land with Della's information and Arthur's Tennyson sitting next to each other in her mind, and doing something complicated. She stopped her horse at the ridge above the valley that held both her property and his, the place where you could see the whole sweep of land laid out below. The two ranches running adjacent to each other along the creek that cut through the lower pastures, the mountains rising behind everything in their indifferent and spectacular way. She sat there for several minutes and looked at the shape of the land and tried to see it the way Arthur had described it, the way two operations sharing a water source and the same grazing pressures would face the same extinction together without knowing it, the way the solution to both was the same solution. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him carefully and honestly, the way she allowed herself to only rarely, because it still had teeth. She thought about what he had been like, the particular texture of their life together, the way he had laughed at her stubbornness with open affection instead of frustration, the way he had told her once that she was the most capable and frightening person he had ever loved, and that these two things were related. She thought about what he would say if he could see her now, standing guard over their land alone with walls built around every vulnerable place. She thought he would probably tell her she was being stupid, with exactly the gentle specificity he had always applied to her worst decisions. She turned her horse toward Arthur Garrett's fence line. He was in the north pasture when she found him, checking the hooves of a roan mare that had picked up a stone bruise. He looked up when he heard her horse, and he did not say anything, just waited. "The water arrangement," she said, "and the grazing rotation. I want to see the numbers you have worked out before I agree to anything." "I have them at the house," he said. "Then let us go look at them." He set the mare's hoof down, straightened, and looked at her with that steady look of his. "All right," he said. His house was larger than hers, but not better kept. It was clean in the practical way of a man who had no patience for disorder, but no interest in decoration either. There was a desk in the corner of the main room that was organized with the kind of meticulous care that spoke to a man who used it regularly, and on it were spread papers and a ledger, and a survey map of both properties that he had apparently been working on for some time. Ruby stood over it and studied it while Arthur put water on for coffee and said nothing, which she appreciated. The plan was good, more than good. It was thorough and practical, and it had clearly been thought through with the kind of careful intelligence that recognized the land's demands without romanticizing them. He had calculated the water usage, the carrying capacity of the combined pasture, the cost savings on equipment if shared, the timeline for deepening the ridge well. He had also noted, with a frankness she found both startling and correct, the particular vulnerabilities in each operation that the other could shore up. "You noted that I lose time on mechanical repairs," she said. "You do," he said, bringing the coffee. "You are capable of making them, but they take you longer than they should because you learned them alone and by necessity. I have been repairing machinery since I was 12. It is an area where I have more to offer than you do. And I noted you have not yet established a canning and preservation system for your food stores," she said. "Your cook quit in August and you have not replaced him, and your winter provision is insufficient." He looked at her. "You observed that." "I have been observing you for some time also," she said. not with the same consistency as your fence line schedule, but enough. Something shifted in his face, something that was the beginning of something. So we are both people who do not say things until we are certain of them, he said. It seems that way, she said. They went over the numbers for the better part of 2 hours, sitting across from each other at his desk, and Ruby made corrections and suggestions, and he listened to them with genuine attention and incorporated the good ones and said plainly when he thought she was wrong about something and the reasons he thought so. She corrected him back twice, and both times he considered it and conceded the point. By the end of it, she felt more intellectually alive than she had in months, which was its own kind of warning sign, but a warning sign she had started to feel willing to look at directly. I want a written agreement, she said, witnessed by someone in town. And I want it to include a clause that specifies what happens to the arrangement if one party decides to end it. Agreed, he said. And I want it understood that this is a business arrangement first, she said. Whatever else you said at my table stays at my table until I say otherwise. He looked at her for a moment. Understood, he said, on one condition. What condition? That you do not use the business arrangement as a reason never to let the other conversation happen, he said. I am agreeable to patience. I am not agreeable to a permanent postponement disguised as business. She stared at him. You are remarkably direct for a man who spent 4 months engineering accidental meetings at a fence line. The fence line was the indirect version, he said. This is the direct version. I thought you would prefer the direct version. She did prefer it. That was the problem with Arthur Garrett. She kept preferring things about him that she had not given herself permission to prefer. Write the agreement, she said. We will take it to the bank in Crestfall on Thursday. He wrote it that evening. She read every word and changed 2 clauses and initialed all of it. On Thursday, they rode separately into Crestfall and signed it at the bank in front of the manager, a careful man named Aldrich who had once suggested to Ruby that she might find the land difficult and who now looked at her with the particular expression of a person revising a previously held assessment. Della Prout saw them through the bank window, and Ruby could see her storing the observation like a squirrel storing a particularly fine nut. The working arrangement began the following week. It changed things in ways Ruby had not entirely anticipated. The first change was practical and immediate. Arthur came to help mend the south pasture fence and brought a post driver that was faster than anything she had been using. And between the two of them, they finished a job that would have taken her 3 days in a single afternoon. There was something quietly extraordinary about this that Ruby felt she needed to be careful about, because the relief of having another competent person working alongside her was so significant that it sat dangerously close to feeling necessary, and she was not yet prepared to let anything feel necessary. The second change was the cattle rotation, which required them to be in the same place at roughly the same time every 2 days to manage the movement between pastures. This meant conversation, practical conversation at first, about the cattle, the grass, the weather signs, the state of the creek. But practicality has a natural tendency to expand when 2 intelligent people are in regular proximity, and within 3 weeks they were talking about other things. He told her about New Mexico, about the land down there which was different from Colorado in specific ways that she found herself genuinely interested in, more red and open and ancient feeling, the mountains a different character. He told her about the cattle operations he had worked on after Clara died, moving from ranch to ranch in a way that now, in the telling of it, he named directly as running, which was a word that seemed to cost him something to say. She told him about Missouri, about her family's farm there, about the particular ambition she had felt from early childhood to have land that was her own rather than her father's, about how Thomas Reed had seemed to understand that ambition in a way that most men of her acquaintance had not, and how that understanding had been a significant part of why she had loved him. You came west for the land, Arthur said, not for a romantic notion of frontier life. I came west because the Homestead Act meant a woman who filed as head of household could claim land, she said. Thomas came with me because he was the kind of man who supported what his wife needed rather than constraining her to what was convenient for him. I think he is rarer than he should be. Arthur was quiet for a moment. Clara was the one who chose New Mexico, he said. She had family there, a brother who had ranched in the territory since the 60s. She wanted to build something near family, and I wanted what she wanted. I think that is the right way of it, wanting what the other person needs even when it is not your first choice. They looked at each other across the fence post they were currently stapling wire to, and the weight of what they were both not yet saying moved between them like weather. You are good with cattle, he said then, moving the conversation back to solid ground. I am good with most animals, she said. They are straightforward in their needs. They do not say one thing and mean another. Neither do I, he said. No, she said. You do not, and she turned back to the wire. Winter came down from the mountains in November with serious intent, bringing 3 early snows that tested the south pasture fence repeatedly, and kept both of them busy in ways that left little room for anything except work. But the working arrangement meant that the work was shared, and sharing it had an effect that Ruby had not predicted, which was that she stopped being quite so exhausted. It was not that the work was less. It was that the weight of it was distributed across 2 sets of shoulders, and this made a difference that she felt in her body, in the way she slept at night, in the way she was able to look at the day ahead without the particular dread that had been accumulating at the back of her mind for 3 years. She found herself, on the mornings when they were not working together, occasionally looking out the window of her farmhouse in the direction of his land. Just checking, she told herself. Just the habit of a person aware of another person's proximity. It was not more than that. Arthur came to help repair her barn roof when a section of it collapsed under the weight of a December snowfall, and they worked on it together for a full day in cold that made their breath come out in long plumes. And at the end of it, Ruby brought out the last of her apple cider, and they sat on the repaired section of the porch and drank it in the gathering dark, and did not talk very much because they had been talking all day, and the quiet between them had become, sometime in the past weeks, a comfortable quiet rather than a careful one. It holds, Arthur said, looking up at the repaired section of roof. It holds, she agreed. Good barn, he said. Good bones. She looked at him sideways. He was looking at the barn with the honest, appreciative look he gave to things that were well made, and she thought suddenly that he was the kind of man who noticed quality and said so plainly, who did not give compliments for the sake of charm but gave them when they were accurate, and this was the kind of thing that got under a person's defenses without asking permission. She did not say anything. She drank her cider and let the dark come. Christmas passed. Ruby went to the Crestfall church service on Christmas morning because Thomas had loved Christmas, and it felt disloyal not to mark it. And she saw Arthur there, standing near the back in the way of a man attending out of private feeling rather than public performance. They nodded to each other. She noticed that he had a careful relationship with the service, attentive but not performative, which matched what she knew of him. Afterward, in the cold outside the church, Della Prout materialized at her elbow with the unfailing instinct of a woman who had spent 30 years as the connective tissue of a small community. Your neighbor looks well, Della said conversationally. He does, Ruby said. The 2 of you have been spending considerable time working together, Della said. I imagine that must be useful given the arrangements you filed at the bank. It is exactly as useful as a well-run working arrangement should be, Ruby said. Della smiled the smile of a woman who was hearing exactly what she expected and finding it entertaining. Of course, she said. How's the south pasture holding up? Ruby turned to look at her directly. Della, I like you. I want you to know that what you are doing right now is visible. Della's smile did not change at all. I am talking about pasture management, she said. What are you talking about? Ruby went home. In January, the blizzard came. It came the way serious blizzards come in Colorado, which is to say with very little warning and an absolute seriousness of intention. dropping 2 feet of snow in the first 12 hours and continuing for another 36 after that. Ruby had seen the signs 2 days before, the particular quality of the light and the specific behavior of her cattle, which had been moving toward the south corner of the pasture in the restless, uncertain way of animals sensing incoming weather. And she had spent those 2 days in preparation, laying in extra firewood, checking the barn insulation, bringing the 2 horses into the close stall, securing the pump housing against freeze. She had sent a note to Arthur via the boy who sometimes ran errands between the neighboring properties, recommending the same preparations. She did not know whether he had received it before the snow closed in. When the blizzard was at its worst, on the second night, she woke to the sound of something at her door, a sound that cut through the wind's noise because it had a human quality to it. She was out of bed with the rifle before she was fully awake. She opened the door and Arthur Garrett fell into her front room. He was covered in snow, and his left hand was wrapped in a scarf that was dark with blood, and his lips had the bluish quality of a man who had been in the cold too long. She did not think. She pulled him inside, pushed the door shut against the wind, got him to the floor near the stove which was still warm from the night's banked fire. "What happened?" she said, already moving for the supply box where she kept her medical kit. "Wire," he said through chattering teeth. "Loose wire in the storm, past your fence. I went to check the north section before dark and the wire caught my hand on the way back." He paused, breathing. "My hands were too cold to feel it at the time. I made it to the house and dressed it, but the bleeding did not stop, and then I thought about you alone over here with this storm, and I thought I should—" "Stop talking," she said, not unkindly, and unwrapped his hand. The cut was deep along the palm, from the base of the thumb diagonally across to the small finger. It had bled significantly. She cleaned it with alcohol from her kit, which made him hiss through his teeth, and then she stitched it with the small needle and thread she kept for exactly these occasions, working by the firelight with steady hands while he sat against the wall and watched her face. "You have done this before," he said. "I have stitched my own leg twice," she said. "Your hand is easier." When she finished and bound it, she built the fire up and made tea, strong and hot, and brought it to him, and they sat by the fire on the floor because neither of them suggested moving to chairs, and somehow the floor seemed correct for the particular intimacy of the situation. "You were going to check on me," she said. "Was," he said. "You cut your hand badly in a blizzard and you thought before attending to yourself that you should come check whether I was safe." "You are alone," he said, as if this were sufficient explanation. "I have been alone for 3 years," she said. "I have managed blizzards before." "I know," he said. "I was not questioning your capacity to manage a blizzard. I was—" He stopped. He looked at the fire. "I was not able to sleep for thinking about whether you were all right. That is the plain truth of it." Ruby looked at her teacup. Outside, the blizzard was doing its enormous and indifferent work. Inside, the fire was warm and the house was small, and Arthur Garrett was sitting 3 feet from her with a newly stitched hand and honesty in every line of his face. "You have been worried about me," she said. "Since I arrived here, to some degree," he said. "It has become more specific recently." "More specific," she said. "More constant," he said. "More of a weight in my chest that I carry around and cannot entirely account for in purely neighborly terms." She looked at him then. Really looked at him, the way she had been carefully avoiding doing, the way she now permitted herself because the blizzard and the stitched hand and 3 in the morning had removed the careful avoidance's justification. "Arthur," she said. "Ruby," he said. "I need you to understand something," she said. "I am not a person who loves lightly. I did not love Thomas easily or without cost. I gave everything I had to that marriage, and when he died I gave everything I had to surviving the loss of it, and I do not have any guarantee that I could do either of those things again without—" She stopped. "Without what?" he said, very quietly. "Without being remade by it," she said. "Without it changing everything, and I have built something here that is mine, not ours, not anyone else's, mine. And I am afraid of what it means to let something matter to me again, because the last time something mattered to me this much it was taken, and I did not break, but I came close enough to the edge of it that I could see down. The fire shifted. He was very still. "I know that edge," he said. "I have stood on it. I know what you are describing." He looked at her with the weight of a man who had earned his words the hard way. "I am not asking you to step off of it. I am not asking you to give up what you have built or to need me in a way that feels like vulnerability without support. I am asking if you might be willing to have someone standing next to you on it, still on the edge, still aware of how far down it goes, but not alone there." Ruby looked at him for a long time. The wind outside was full of everything the world could throw at you. Inside was the fire and the warmth, and this man with his honest eyes and his stitched hand and his 7-year-old grief that matched the shape of her own grief in the way that two wounds made by the same kind of loss will sometimes match. "I am not promising anything tonight," she said. "I am not asking for a promise tonight," he said. "I am asking for the door to be open." She reached out and put her hand over his bound one lightly, just resting it there for a moment. "The door is open," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers gently, with the kind of care that a man applies to things he has learned are precious. They stayed by the fire until the blizzard eased, not speaking much, just present, and Ruby Reed felt something unlock inside her chest that she had locked herself 3 years ago for good and sufficient reasons, and she let herself feel the unlocking without immediately trying to lock it back up, which was the bravest thing she had done in a long time. The blizzard released Crestfall County 2 days later. The world came out white and still and entirely remade, the way it always does after a serious storm, and the work of digging out and checking the livestock and assessing the damage occupied both of them fully for the better part of a week. But the thing that had happened by the fire was still in the air between them, present and acknowledged, and it changed the way they moved around each other. There were small things at first. He brought her coffee when they were working in the cold, without being asked, with the ease of a man who had learned her preferences. She brought food when they were repairing the north fence, 2 portions, naturally, without ceremony. He began to leave notes occasionally in the split in the fence post where the properties met, practical notes about cattle movement and weather signs, and once a note that said only, "The creek is running cleaner today," which was a practical observation and also felt like a small gift. She wrote back, practical notes, and once a note that said, "I saw your lights on past midnight again." "You do not have to work every hour of it," he wrote back. "You were watching my lights." She did not reply to that one, which was a kind of reply. February brought a stretch of clear, cold weather that was easier to work in than the blizzard's aftermath, and on a Sunday afternoon when the work was done for the day, and the light was doing its late winter thing of turning everything gold and cold simultaneously, Arthur knocked at her door, and when she opened it he was holding a small book. "Tennyson," he said. "Delaprout mentioned you liked poetry." "Delaprout is a woman with entirely too much information and not enough discretion about using it," Ruby said, but she took the book. "There is a passage in it I have been thinking about," he said. "I marked it." She opened to the marked page later that evening, after he had gone, and read the passage, which was from In Memoriam, and which was about the nature of grief and the possibility of the world continuing to hold beauty after loss. And she sat with it for a long time, and felt that Arthur Garrett was a man who knew how to say things indirectly when the direct version was still too new to say, which was something she understood very well. Spring came to the Colorado plains with the particular quality of grace that follows hard winters, green pushing up through the brown, with an insistence that felt like an argument against despair. The creek ran higher and cleaner than it had the previous year, fed by the snowmelt from the mountains, and the combined pasture management they had been practicing through the winter meant that both operations came into spring with better grass cover and stronger cattle than either would have had independently. They were checking the cattle in the south pasture together on a warm April afternoon when Arthur said, without any particular preamble, I would like to take you to dinner in Crestfall. At the hotel dining room on Saturday, Ruby kept her eyes on the cattle. That would be noticed, she said. Yes, he said. Delaprout would have it around the county by Monday morning. Yes, he said. You understand that and you are still asking. I am asking precisely because I understand that, he said. I am done with fence-line meetings and marked books. I am asking you to dinner, Ruby, as clearly as I know how. She looked at him. His face was open and a little vulnerable in the way that a genuinely direct man's face is vulnerable when he has put himself squarely out there and is waiting. She thought about Thomas again, the way she sometimes did as a kind of internal check, and she found that what she felt was not guilt. What she felt was something closer to gratitude, because Thomas had made her capable of recognizing a good man when she saw one. Saturday, she said, I will meet you there at 6. You could let me ride over and bring you, he said. I could, she said. I will meet you there at 6. The corner of his mouth moved. All right then. The hotel dining room in Crestfall was not elaborate. It had 8 tables, a menu that varied depending on what the cook had access to, and a general atmosphere of practical respectability. It was also, on a Saturday evening, attended by a significant portion of the people who constituted Crestfall's social fabric, and when Ruby Reed walked in and was shown to a table where Arthur Garrett was already seated and rose when she arrived, there was a particular quality of attention in the room that she ignored deliberately and completely. He had dressed carefully, not formally, but with the kind of considered care that meant he had thought about it. His shirt was clean and pressed, and his hair was combed, and he looked at her when she came in with an expression that she stored in a private place inside herself, because it was the kind of expression that meant something serious. You came, he said. I said I would, she said. You are a person of your word, he said. I have learned that. They ate. The food was good, simple beef and roasted potatoes and bread, and they talked about the cattle and the spring pasture and the creek levels and the plans for deepening the ridge well, which was all practical and grounded and also entirely not the point of the evening. The point of the evening was that they were there together, publicly, in the way that meant something in a small western town in 1882, and they both knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. At the end of the meal over coffee, he said, I have been thinking about the arrangement. Arrangement, she said carefully. The business one, he said, and something in his eyes was careful and warm simultaneously. I have been thinking that it might benefit from being made more permanent, more formally integrated, in a way that would simplify both operations and give the land a single future instead of 2 parallel ones. She looked at him. You are talking about merging the properties. I am talking about merging everything, he said. The dining room was doing its business around them. Somewhere near the back, she was fairly certain Delaprout had chosen this specific evening to take her dinner at the hotel rather than at home, which was either a coincidence or wasn't. Arthur, she said. I know what I am asking, he said. I am not asking lightly. I have been thinking about nothing else for the better part of 4 months, and I know my own mind on it as clearly as I have ever known anything. He paused. I love you, Ruby. I love the way you work, and the way you think, and the way you said your land was yours and meant it, and the way you stitched my hand in the middle of a blizzard without flinching, and the way you read my notes in the fence post and wrote back even when you were trying not to. He stopped. I am asking you to marry me. I am asking if you will have me. Ruby Reed sat very still for a moment with the weight of the question all around her like weather. She thought about the first day she had seen this land, 4 years ago, and the particular feeling of knowing she was exactly where she needed to be. She thought about Thomas and about how grief was not betrayal, and about the passage in the Tennyson book that Arthur had marked. She thought about the blizzard and the fire and her hand over his and the door that she had said was open. She thought about the fact that she had come to the hotel alone on a horse she had saddled herself, and she would go home the same way because that was who she was, and she understood that Arthur Garrett was not asking her to be anything other than that. Yes, she said, I will. Something moved across his face that was unlike anything she had seen there before, something unguarded and young. And for a moment she saw through the weathered exterior to the man beneath it. The man who had loved someone and lost her and built himself back up and crossed a fence line and said the plain truth and waited. And she felt something very warm and very real settle into her chest and stay there. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. From the back of the dining room there was a sound that Ruby recognized, without turning, as Della Prout insufficiently suppressing a reaction of pure delighted vindication. They were married in June. The ceremony was at the Crestfall Church on a morning when the mountains were very blue, and the wildflowers were out along the road, and the whole of Crestfall County seemed to have found reasons to be in town, because small communities understand that some events are not private no matter how much the people involved might prefer them to be. Della Prout was there in the front row with her husband the postmaster, wearing her good dress, and a very self-satisfied expression that Ruby chose to find endearing. Ruby wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool bought at the general store. Not white because white was impractical, and she was a practical woman. And she wore Thomas's pocket watch on a chain around her neck, because he had given it to her the morning they arrived in Colorado, and she had kept it since. And it seemed right to carry him with her into this new thing, rather than pretend the history did not exist. Arthur saw the watch when she walked toward him and recognized what it meant, and his expression said that he understood it without needing it explained. And this was one of the things she loved most about him. Dr. Moss, who also performed occasional ministerial duties because Crestfall's minister was elderly and frequently unwell, conducted the ceremony with a plain-spoken efficiency that suited them both. When he asked Arthur if he took Ruby Reed to be his wife and Arthur said, "I do," it came out with a particular quiet gravity that made the room very still. When Ruby said the same, she said it with her chin up and her eyes on Arthur's face and her voice entirely steady. They moved into the farmhouse that had been Ruby's, because it was the better house and also because Ruby said so. And Arthur did not argue because he understood that there were things that mattered for reasons beyond the practical, and this was one of them. His two ranch hands, a quiet man named Pete and an older hand named Jonas who had been with Arthur since New Mexico, continued to live on the Garrett property in the bunkhouse and work the combined operation as they had before. The merging of the two ranches was more complicated in the details than in the principle, and Ruby and Arthur spent several weeks of evenings working through it at the desk that had come from his house and now sat in the corner of their shared front room, the same desk where she had first seen the plans he had drawn up for the water arrangement. She made suggestions and he incorporated them, and they disagreed productively about 3 things and agreed on all of them eventually. And the working out of it was satisfying in the specific way that a genuinely shared project is satisfying, when both parties bring equal intelligence and genuine commitment. The combined operation, which they registered at the county land office as the Reed Garrett Ranch, ran 120 head of cattle by the end of that first summer, and was on sound enough financial footing that Ruby was able to pay off the last of the bank debt that had been Thomas's and hers from the beginning, which she did on a Tuesday morning in August, and which felt like closing a chapter rather than erasing it. Arthur noticed that she was quiet that evening after she returned from the bank, and he sat with her on the porch in the long summer dark without requiring her to explain it, which was exactly the right thing. After a while she told him about the debt, about what it had meant when Thomas took it out and what it meant now to have cleared it, and he listened without interrupting and without trying to tell her how to feel about it. And when she was finished he said, "He would be proud of what you have kept alive here." And she believed him because he had no reason to say it except that it was true. In September she discovered she was expecting their child. She told Arthur on a morning when the aspens on the ridge had just begun their turning, the particular golden that made the mountains look as though they were lit from inside, and he was coming in from the early morning check of the cattle, and she was standing on the porch with coffee, and she said it plainly, as they did things between them, without ceremony. He stopped on the porch steps. He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had not seen before on his face and could not entirely read. She remembered that Clara had died in childbirth, that the child had died too, that this news did not carry only joy for him, but also the particular weight of that history. She said, "I know what you are thinking." "Do you?" he said quietly. "You are thinking about what can go wrong," she said. "I am too, if I am honest. But Dr. Moss is capable and I am strong and I am not going to fall apart from worry before there is anything to worry about." He came up the steps and put his arms around her carefully, and she felt his breath against the top of her head, and the way he held her was different from how he usually held her, more deliberate, like a man recalibrating around something precious. "I am also thinking," he said, "that I did not believe I would have this again, that I stopped believing I was allowed to want it." "You are allowed," she said. "I know that now," he said. "You have been very effective at teaching me that." The pregnancy was not easy in the physical sense, because Colorado winters and heavy work and the realities of frontier life did not gentle themselves for a pregnant woman's convenience. But Ruby was determinedly well, and Dr. Moss checked on her regularly through the winter months and pronounced everything as it should be. Arthur rearranged the work so that the heaviest physical tasks fell to him and to Pete and Jonas, without making it obvious that he had done this, which she saw clearly and chose not to address because it was done with care and not condescension. Their son was born in May of 1884, on a morning when the spring rains had just ended, and the air was clean and cold, delivered by Dr. Moss with the kind of brisk efficiency that came from a man who had done this many times in difficult conditions, and knew that the best thing he could do was to let nature do its work, and only intervene when necessary. Ruby worked through it with the same focused determination she brought to everything, and Arthur was outside on the porch for the entirety of it, which she had requested, because she needed to be able to concentrate without worrying about his worry. When Dr. Moss brought the baby to the door and told Arthur it was a boy and that Ruby and the child were both well, Ruby heard from inside, the particular quality of silence that a man makes when he is trying to contain something too large for ordinary expression. They named him James Thomas Garrett, James for Arthur's father, who had been a good man by all accounts, and who Arthur rarely spoke of with anything except a kind of quiet reverence, and Thomas for the obvious reason. "You are sure about Thomas," Arthur said when they discussed it. "I am more sure about it than almost anything," Ruby said. "He was here first. This land carries his name already. It is fitting." Arthur looked at the baby in her arms and then at her face. "All right," he said. "James Thomas it is." James Thomas Garrett was, from the beginning, a child of emphatic opinions and considerable volume, which led Arthur to observe that he had clearly inherited his mother's personality, and Ruby to observe that he had inherited his father's stubbornness, and both of them to agree that the combination was likely to be challenging, and also that they were very happy about it. The years of the mid-1880s were not easy ones for cattle ranching in Colorado. A combination of factors, including the overextension of the open range system across the West, fluctuating beef prices, and the severe weather events that would culminate in the devastating winter of 1886 to 1887, created pressures across the industry that broke many operations that had seemed secure. The Reed Garrett Ranch was not immune to these pressures, but the careful planning that Arthur and Ruby had been doing since before they married, the water management, the rotational grazing, the diversification of their income through a small hay operation they had begun selling to neighboring ranchers, and the ridge well that they had deepened 2 years earlier, gave them a resilience that many of their neighbors lacked. They lost cattle in the brutal winter of 1886 to 1887, when the blizzards came one after another, and the temperatures dropped to levels that killed livestock across the range, regardless of preparation. Everyone lost cattle that winter. The question was whether you lost enough to survive or enough to break you. And the answer for Reed Garrett was survival, but only just. And the spring of 1887 found them thinner in the herd and tighter in the finances than they had been in several years. Ruby sat with the ledger one April morning and ran the numbers and came out with a picture that was difficult but not hopeless. And she brought it to Arthur, and they sat together with the numbers between them the same way they had sat at the beginning, when it had all been a proposed arrangement rather than a shared life. "We sell the hay surplus and put everything into rebuilding the herd," Arthur said. "We take no wages for ourselves for the season." "Agreed," Ruby said, "and we let Jonas go." Jonas had been with Arthur since New Mexico and was well past the age of easy work and deserved a rest regardless, but they had been reluctant to address it before necessity made the decision. "I will speak to him myself," Arthur said. "He has family in Denver. I will make sure he gets there." "And Pete stays," Ruby said. "Pete stays," Arthur agreed. "He is worth 3 hands in terms of what he knows about this land." Pete had been with them through 5 years by that point, and had become as much a part of the Reed Garrett operation as the cattle themselves. A quiet and extraordinarily competent man who had apparently no ambitions beyond doing his work well and being left to do it, which suited everyone. They rebuilt the herd through 1887 and 1888. It was leaner than the years before, but they came through it. And when Arthur calculated the cattle values in the fall of 1888 and showed Ruby the numbers, they were back to where they had been before the terrible winter and trending forward. James Thomas, who was 4 years old by then, and had opinions about everything including the correct way to manage cattle, which he expressed at length and with complete conviction, had developed the habit of following Arthur around the ranch from the time he could walk independently, which Arthur bore with patience and genuine pleasure, answering the boy's constant questions with the same careful directness he applied to everything. "He will ask you something you cannot answer eventually," Ruby said one evening, watching Arthur explain the operation of the water pump to James, who was listening with the focused concentration of a very small person confronting a complex mechanism. "He already has," Arthur said. "Yesterday he asked me why the sky turns that color when the sun goes down, and I told him honestly that I do not know the full reason, and he told me I should find out." "What did you say?" "I told him he was right and that we would both find out together," Arthur said. "Then I found myself reading a volume on atmospheric phenomena that I borrowed from Dr. Moss's library, which is not where I expected to spend my Tuesday evening." Ruby laughed, which was a sound that had come more easily in the past several years, settling into her life naturally in the way that happiness tends to when you stop fighting it. She laughed, and Arthur looked at her with the particular expression he had for her when she laughed, which was the expression of a man who had waited a long time to have this, and who was aware of that and grateful for it with a depth that had never become ordinary. The summer of 1889 brought news that Colorado was pursuing statehood, which had finally been achieved in 1876, but whose full implications continued to unfold in the organization of land rights and county governance. And it also brought the information that the Harkers Crossing Supply Post had finally gotten a telegraph line, connecting their stretch of the plains to the broader world in a way that changed things in small but meaningful ways. It also brought, in August, the news that Ruby was expecting their second child. This time Arthur's reaction was different. Not different in the depth of feeling, but different in the absence of the shadow that had been in it the first time. He was simply, straightforwardly, deeply happy about it and did not try to contain it or qualify it or balance it against old grief. "You have changed," Ruby said that evening on the porch. "You have changed me," he said. "Those are different things." "What is the difference?" "The first implies I decided to be different," he said. "The second is accurate. You did it without asking permission, and I am entirely in favor of how it turned out." She leaned into his shoulder, which was something she had started doing somewhere in the course of their marriage, and which he had accommodated in the immediate and entirely natural way of a man who had been waiting for exactly this wait. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara Rose Garrett, was born in March of 1890. Clara for the obvious reason, Rose because Ruby had loved roses since childhood and had planted a wild rose bush against the south side of the farmhouse 2 years earlier that had taken wonderfully and bloomed every June in a manner that Arthur claimed was excessive and Ruby claimed was exactly right. Clara Rose was born with a full head of dark hair and an expression of absolute assessment in her first moments, looking around the room as if cataloging everything and finding it adequate, and Dr. Moss declared her the most opinionated newborn he had encountered in 30 years of practice, which Ruby took as a compliment. James Thomas, who was 5 and had been prepared for the arrival of a sibling with extensive prior consultation, regarded his sister with a solemnity that suggested he was aware of the responsibility of the position and intended to take it seriously. "She is very small," he said. "You were very small once also," Arthur told him. "I do not remember that," James said, with the tone of a person reserving judgment on a claim they find dubious. Ruby, lying in bed with Clara Rose in the particular exhausted peace of the post-birth hours, watched Arthur standing with his son looking at his daughter, and felt something so full and complete that she could not have named it with any single word. She thought about the fence, and the afternoon, and the cold look in the sky that day, and Arthur's voice saying those words that had changed everything. She thought about how she had stood with a rifle and a wall around her heart, and how the wall had been necessary, and also how it was good that it was gone. She thought about Thomas, and she let him be there in the room with her in the way that the people you have loved and lost do remain, not as a grief but as a presence, warm and approving and at rest. The Reed Garrett Ranch continued to grow in the years that followed. By 1892, they ran 240 head of cattle and had added a small stable operation, supplying horses to the growing settlement communities to the south. Pete had stayed through all of it and had been given a share in the operation, in recognition of what his loyalty and labor had built alongside theirs, and he had accepted it with the same wordless dignity that characterized everything he did. The town of Crestfall had grown as well, with a proper school now and a second doctor, and a small newspaper that Arthur occasionally contributed to, with letters about land management that were more widely read than he expected. Ruby had been elected to the school board in 1891, which had required some politics to achieve, because there were men who thought a woman's place on a school board was novel, and she had dealt with this the same way she dealt with everything, which was to show up prepared and competent and persistent until the novelty gave way to the reality. Della Prout remained a fixture of the town's social fabric and had maintained, through the years, the particular warm proprietorial interest in Ruby and Arthur's life together that she had demonstrated from the beginning. She attended both children's birthday celebrations and gave excellent practical gifts. She also told Ruby, on Ruby's 35th birthday, that watching her had been one of the more satisfying experiences of her life in this community. "You came here a widow with a rifle and a debt and an expression that could have stopped a river," Della said, "and you built this." "We built this," Ruby said. "Yes," Della said, "that is exactly what I mean." On a Sunday morning in the autumn of 1892, when James Thomas was 8 and Clara Rose was 2.5 and the aspens on the ridge had reached their full gold, and the mountains beyond them were beginning to take their winter snow at the peaks, Ruby and Arthur walked the southern boundary of their land together in the early morning, while Pete watched the children at the house. It was a walk they had taken many times over the years, an informal inspection that served as much as a ritual as a practicality, a way of being present in what they had built together. The fence lines were sound. The south pasture grass was coming back well after the summer's grazing. The creek ran clear and adequate. They stopped at the fence line where Arthur had first come to her side of things, 10 years before now, the post he had leaned against when he said the words that had split her careful solitude open. The post was replaced, obviously. They had replaced every post on that line twice over in the intervening decade. But the location was the same stretch of fence between what had been her land and what had been his and was now theirs together. "I think about this spot sometimes," Arthur said. "I know," she said. "So do I. You had the rifle," he said. "I always have the rifle," she said. "I know," he said, and she could hear the smile in it without looking. "I was terrified." She looked at him. "You did not show it." "I was raised to consider showing terror a disadvantage," he said. "I have since revised that opinion." "I was terrified too," she said, "for entirely different reasons." "What reasons?" he said, though she thought he probably knew. "Because you were right," she said, "about all of it, about the land and the water and the weight of doing everything alone. And I knew you were right, and I had been right about all of it for so long on my own, that being agreed with felt more frightening than being argued with." "And the other reasons," he said. She looked at the fence post, and at the land beyond it that was theirs, and at the mountains that had watched all of it happen with their permanent, unhurried witness. "Because you looked at me like I was worth looking at," she said. "And I had forgotten what that felt like, and it was terrifying to remember." He put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him the way she had learned to do, and they stood there in the October morning with the gold and the cold and the enormous sky, and the land they had made between them spread out in every direction, alive and continuing. "I am glad I came to the fence," he said. "I am glad you did not leave when I lifted the rifle," she said. "You would not have shot me," he said. "No," she said, "but I considered it." His laugh was low and genuine, and she felt it through her shoulder where she leaned against him. They stood there a while longer, not needing to say more, because some things become truer the fewer words they require, and this was one of them. The full weight of what they had made together standing between the mountains and the open plain in the clear autumn air, held between two people who had each learned the cost of loss and chosen, despite that knowledge, to build something worth losing, and in doing so had found it was also worth keeping, worth tending, worth waking for in the early dark and working toward through all the seasons, worth every difficult and necessary and extraordinary moment of it. The cattle were in the far pasture. The children were at the house with Pete, and James Thomas was probably already asking questions about something mechanical, and Clara Rose was probably trying to follow the cats around the barn. And the ledger at home showed numbers that were solid and growing, and the rose bush on the south wall of the farmhouse would bloom again come June, and the fence line ran sound and true as far as the eye could reach in both directions. And Ruby Reed, who had once stood alone in this landscape with a rifle and a wall around everything that mattered, stood now with her husband in the morning light of a life they had built together from the honest and difficult and finally triumphant beginning of one. Plain sentence spoken at a fence. She had been working this land alone long enough. She was not alone anymore. And the land and the years and everything that grew in them stretched out ahead without limit, full of the particular and irreplaceable richness of a life shared between two people who had chosen each other with open eyes and kept on choosing every morning for all the mornings that remained.